Hello, and welcome to another episode of Testing Peers. This week, we're going to talk about interviews and tests for testers. Joining me this week, we have Chris.
Hello.
We have David.
Hiya.
And we have Simon.
Hello.
I'm Russell. We just want to, before we start, give a little shout out to Saffron QA. They're our sponsors and they're specialists in test recruitment. And they do a range of bespoke recruitment services around the QA world. And you can find out more information about them in our show notes or by going to saffronqa.co.uk. We're very grateful for their contributions. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Russell. I was thinking that we're obviously going to be talking today about interview tests for testers. And my daughter's learning how to drive. And I was thinking back to driving tests. What incidents can you remember from your own driving tests or incidents where you have been either a passenger or been behind a learner driver that you have noticed about that? And that can be the theory test or the driving test. So what stories have you got in pre-driving test incidents?
That's a touchy subject.
I was dreading you bringing this up. It took me 5 attempts to pass. I'd like to say it's because 3 of the tests I had this very stern examiner who was very pernickety because he was a motorcycle rider and he was very fussy on anything that was slightly putting motorcyclists at risks, etc., etc. One test I did absolutely perfectly. Like there was no issue. There was no minors, no nothing until the very last minute. And a motorcycle cut me up in the middle lane of a 3-way traffic junction with traffic lights and everything. And I didn't react quick enough. The instructor had his hand on the wheel before I did. So therefore I failed.
Hands were off the wheel?
Well, sorry, no. His hand was on the wheel before I reacted. I was already driving, but I hadn't reacted as quickly as he did.
I'd be worried there, Simon.
He had to fail me there and then. But yeah, driving tests were not something I was particularly proud of. I almost got to the point where my theory almost expired because I'd passed it so long ago that it took me 5 attempts to then pass the practical.
So I'll not say how many times it took me to pass, but...
Go on, be transparent, Russell.
Okay, the first time. I wasn't trying to rub it in. Sorry, Simon. The day before my driving test, my driving instructor changed cars on me. So he changed from a Micra to a Peugeot 200, 206 or something. And the first time I got in the car, which is pretty much driving to the driving test, pedals were completely different to me. They were tiny, really small, and I've got quite big feet. And the first thing I did driving towards my driving test from my house, was I put my foot on the accelerator and the middle pedal, the brake, at the same time. I just literally floored both of them and just chaos ensued. I started panicking because obviously I couldn't figure out which pedal was which and what was going on, and I could only find 2 pedals with my feet. It's just a bit mad. That got worse. I figured out and I calmed down because the driving instructor helped me. We got to the bottom of the hill, my road. There was a crossroads, traffic light junction. Traffic lights had failed. So this is one of the main roads, the main routes, and everything else has to go for your driving test. And yay. And it was just basically, what do I do? I've never done this in a driving lesson. What do you do in this sort of case? And everyone just edges forward and looks. But it was kind of like a blind bend. You couldn't really see around it or anything. So that petrified me. And I went to my driving test absolutely an anxious wreck, I think is probably the best way of saying it. I don't know whether they knew about the traffic lights, but the driving test avoided that whole area. And I was very, very grateful. But I passed. I think I got the maximum amount of minors. I think it was 14 or something without failing. And I got through it. And if I ever try doing that test again, I am certain I would fail it. I don't know what happened, but everything conspired for me to almost fail, but not quite. So I was quite happy in the end.
See, I tried driving my instructor's car and it was so different from the car that I was learning on at home that I couldn't actually handle it. So I had a very old Peugeot 309 that very heavy steering. It had 4-speed gearbox. It had a manual choke, but it was also very wide as a car and quite long. And the instructor's car was like one of those Rover 215s or something like that. And it had power steering and it was very light and nimble and 5-speed gearbox. And so the gear ratios and everything was off for me. So I actually did my lessons and my tests in my car, which must have been absolutely terrifying for not only the instructor, but the people doing the tests. I actually failed a test for putting my foot on the accelerator and brake during the emergency stop. I did stop, but the engine made a rather large roar. Now, where I come from, much like Simon, there are no things called hills. So I didn't get to do a hill start in the test or anything like that. But it was not a great time in my life trying to pass a test. I failed more times than Simon. But I passed only 7 months after my birthday, which may tell you that the motivation within my family was to do a handful of lessons and then just test, fail, test, fail, test, fail until you pass.
How fast?
Had I passed my first test, I would have been a really bad driver. But what I did, I conspired to fail on something different every time, which I think is quite good because you think about all the different things you can fail on as a major in your driving test. It's quite a reasonable amount. The only time it was ever probably actually dangerous was when I was doing a driving test with the flu. I'd been off sixth form for 2 or 3 days, but my mum was like, "We paid for it, so you're going to do it." And we were turning off a road and going down another street, and they said at the end of the road, "You're going to go right." And a few of the roads along this street were one way. So me thinking this one is also one way meant I just moved into the right lane. They said, "Would you mind going onto the legal side of the road?"
Was it at that moment that you realised you'd failed?
To be honest with you, I was kind of not very with it. I had the flu. So I was quite pleased when I passed. I passed in Letchworth Garden City, which is the world's first garden city. And that's important to know. Very safe place. I'm a good driver now. I promise.
I'm so good I don't even have a car anymore. Safest way to be.
So for me, I remember when I first went out, I went out on my birthday with my dad. Went to an empty car park on a Sunday. You know, explained the accelerator, brake and clutch. And my dad said, put your foot on the brake. And the engine was revving up. And I was going, yes, I've got my foot on the brake. And obviously I didn't. I had my foot on the accelerator. So luckily I didn't actually go anywhere. And then for my test, I did pass first time. I was worried about it because it was in the middle of Bournemouth, where I grew up, on a Friday afternoon during rush hour. I remember being stuck in traffic jams for quite a long time. So I did a lot of sort of hill starts, because I was just creeping forward. I remember following a one-way system as well, going around. And also with my emergency stop, I could see him getting ready, but there was a car right behind me. So it happened a couple of miles after he had decided it would happen. That's our stories of driving tests. So let's get on to interview tests for testers. So obviously we've all been giving interviews as part of our management. So I just wondered what types of tests that people actually give for their testers, and also what are the best ones that people have found to get the best testers for their jobs.
Are we going to concentrate on ones that are before the interview, almost like a qualifier, or ones that take place in? Or do you want to do them as separate or together?
Let's cover them all.
Let's cover them all.
Start with whichever one you want, Chris.
Yeah, let's cover everything.
So I've never interviewed somebody that I've sent them a test prior to the interview,
right,
which is both good and bad in the sense for the candidate, because they are told that there's going to be a test during the interview, but they don't know what it is, which could be quite worrying. Whereas I guess when you're sent one in advance, you've got the time to take a look, understand the sort of language and things that's around there. I can't really speak to ones that are before interviews, apart from ones that I've received as a candidate. My preference was always just to have something that highlights the approach to testing as opposed to the explicit language. And so the test that we used was a Python calculator. So it was in command line, and there was a calculator that had some known issues within it. We had a basic user guide and a README, and we just said, how would you test this? Show us. So they're in the command prompt, just writing various different things as per the instruction, just to show us how they would test a calculator in Python. And we'd ask them just to talk us through how they're approaching it, what sort of things would they look at trying to do, and if there was an error, how would they press into that to discover if it was or was not really a bug, or whether it was something more specific or what have you. That's still ongoing. I believe that's still being used there. So I'm not going to give away a single one of those bugs, just in case you're interviewing at that particular place and they offer you a Python calculator.
I had something similar at one of my places of work where they had a calculator. It wasn't a Python one, it wasn't a command line one, it was a little Windows app that came up on screen. And initially, the purpose of it was we'd set them all a test when they come into the building. They do their first interview, they then do the test. We then assess the results. There was a score sheet that somebody in the company had that assessed how many bugs they found, and the higher amount of bugs they found, the more points they got, et cetera, et cetera. Then there was a second stage, which was pick 10 of the bugs you find and write bug reports, et cetera, et cetera. And that was part of the exercise. I push back that actually finding bugs is not all that we do. We need to move away from this, I've got the best ever score of the number of bugs I found, blah, 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 I'm definitely going to be hired kind of attitude, and actually put it more on the test approach, as Chris said. So actually I did start, for some of the hiring I sent out the spec beforehand and said, plan your test approach for this, and then come in and talk us through your test approach in the interview, and moved away from, they may or may not then get to execute their test approach and find some defects, but actually the focus was more on spend some time thinking about it and come to us with your test approach for how you would approach the testing of this app. And actually that worked really well. There was a couple of people that came in, they'd really thoroughly prepared it, and it gave you confidence that it would be tested well. That was what I was looking for. That's the only experience I've had of any kind of test up front. Otherwise, it's been in the actual interview where I've asked questions around whiteboarding a particular scenario and asked for them to approach the testing in that way.
I had rather a complex one for a previous company for an interview I had. I can't remember the exact details, but it was quite in depth and quite technical, and it was hours of work in it. And I think that it actually put some people off with the depth of it. I don't necessarily always think that is a good indication of actually people's capabilities of putting them under that amount of stress for that particular thing.
I've done ones where I've given candidates a test up front and sent them something. So I was particularly looking for automation engineers, people who can automate things a bit more. So we gave them a login to our application, which is a cloud-based free, you get a free trial of it, application, and asked them to automate it. We gave them some pages that we were interested in and some features in that page. And we said, write 5 tests. Use any automation code you want, any language you want, doesn't really matter. I'm not interested in the tech you do. Build a README in it, put it in Git, send us a link to the Git, make sure there's instructions so that we could run it. And we would then review that before the interview and then ask questions around what they did and why they did it to probe into knowledge and understanding. It wasn't about what they did. Often it was about more, did it work? Did they give us instructions that could help us? Were they capable of doing these things? Did they use a model? In the interview, we were referring back to the work they did versus a hypothetical. Why would you use page object model? Or why didn't you? We could refer back to kind of a common understanding of an application sort of thing, which I think worked quite well when you have a known tech or a known thing that you're working towards. It doesn't work necessarily well where you could be hiring for any application. I think candidates found that better because they got given a bit of time, but we didn't give them weeks. And we also set a limit to how many test cases that we wanted. Otherwise, they could obviously go and spend quite a lot of time on it. And we got some good testers out of that, I think.
I think that sounds quite a good thing, because also they're interacting with the application that they're going to be working on, and they do get to see it, and you get to see them interacting with that. So I think that's a much more relevant thing rather than an abstract test preparing something that is not particularly useful. And you can't easily compare people and their skill sets.
When I've done less technical tests, I have done the good old fashioned, and obviously people on the podcast can't see this, but holding a pen up in front of people, asking them how they would test that pen, and just spend a few minutes thinking about the sorts of things they'd want to test on it to generate test ideas, and using that just as a visual cue for people to help them think of something. Again, it's just seeing how people think, and if they think abstractly or if they think sort of linearly, I think. And I quite find that sort of quite a simple test without too much pressure versus kind of an abstract game.
It's an interesting one. I had it when I was interviewing at a place I worked with David, where I was just presented with quite a loose scenario, and then they asked me to come up with a variety of different things. And actually in that interview, they asked me to think more inside the box because I was trying to be creative. But I was left alone for maybe like 20 or 30 minutes after being given a really basic set of requirements, and then they just said come up with a bunch of different test cases, that are things that you would look to test, not necessarily test cases, test areas, scenarios, and then we'll talk through them afterwards. And that was okay. I had no prep work for that interview at all, and I think probably as a candidate I would have preferred a tiny bit of prep work and then be able to come into those things, because I've received as a candidate before tech tests and they say, we estimate this will take you about 9 hours. I'm like, 9 hours for a tech test to maybe not even have an interview? I understand that there's a whole reason why we have screening. There's a whole reason, like if we've got a specific set of skills that we want, then you want to get the people who are okay with things or they understand basic concepts. But 9 hours
Yeah, that kind of tells me that they're after too much as far as not just the workload, obviously they are there, but it's almost that tends to tie in with the roles where people are looking for unicorns, because the amount of work they want out of you, they basically want you to do a job for free almost in that scenario, the work they were getting you to do. And if you're in a full-time job already, then finding 9 hours when you've probably got a family at home or whatever, it's not feasible. And that, I've been in situations past where I've gone, I'm sorry, I'm not doing that. I'm backing out at this point.
No, I did not do the 9-hour test.
Yeah, that's what I was alluding to with my test. I turned it down. I thought, I had a young family at the time and it just wasn't worth it.
This is, I guess, my fear with the technical test I talked about. The example I gave you is we did tell people we don't expect you to spend more than a couple of hours on this. We gave you 7 calendar days, just so that, if you want to manage your time, do it the weekend or do it one evening, it's your choice. We don't expect you to spend 7 days on this, but you can't make people, and it's very hard and it still gets misconstrued and it will put people off. And it is a balance. So we did that one after kind of a cultural fit type questionnaire type telephone interview usually first. So we'd only do it for the people that we thought were good chances.
Is there a question that there's like an accessibility issue with doing things that are a long way in advance? What if you don't own the particular device that would enable you to do those things?
Good point.
At face value, you could say, well, that could be awful. Now, it could be that the company hiring could be very understanding and say, right, well, fine. If there isn't that thing, maybe there's something alternate that will work on a platform that you do have access to, or maybe we can rejig those things. But it's quite intimidating as the candidate to have to ask the recruiting manager or whoever to deviate from what they have laid out as their plan. I don't know how you can really resolve that.
On that, I had something similar when I was a graduate, when I first started applying for roles, which were more developer roles at that time. I didn't have internet at home. And there was a lot, even then, there was a lot of expectation that you need to, we're going to email you this test, you need to do this test, et cetera, et cetera. You need to pass us, send us the code back. And I was using the library computers. I was logging into the library to go and do my applications and whatever else, and only limited times. And I had real issue where I couldn't access the stuff on the library machines that I needed to do the document. So I had to end up contacting some of the companies and say, look, I can't do this. Can we do it by other means? And then it's that whole thing of they can either bend and support you, or they can say, sorry, no, if you can't do it, sorry, you're not going to get the job.
But then would you want to work for a company that...
Exactly. Absolutely. That decision's made for you at that point, isn't it?
One thing I was going to say was about Russell, and it's all very well saying we only expect you to work a couple of hours, but you will get those candidates that will almost take a whole week off on holiday and make the best thing. And actually that doesn't necessarily give the best indication of their work, because if they haven't just spent a couple of hours, if they have spent a whole week on it, then actually what has actually told you that if given enough time, they can polish it.
That's my worry with it,
degree. Whereas actually in workspace, they won't have that luxury.
No, exactly.
Should we talk about the risks then? Because there's obviously risks of plagiarism and other sorts of things as well. What sort of things are the risks for setting ones prior to an interview?
And I was going to say that. I mean, I had to David's point, and I had somebody that they obviously spent more than one evening on it. They'd spent a whole week on it. They'd polished this test approach document up, but they'd copied and pasted stuff from all over the place. You could tell because the styles of the text were in different forms. They'd left quotation marks in and stuff like that. And then when we challenged them on the test approach for some of the tests they'd suggested, they didn't really know what it was. They didn't really know what was in that particular scenario. So it's like they'd got this test plan and they've like 50 odd tests do. But when we started probing, why would you do that test? Why would you do that test? They had no clue. But the document was, several pages long. There was lots of data there. They made it look very professional. So you're right. There is that risk that you give people too much time, and they'll either do something where they have got lots of copyright issues in there, or they'll spend 5 minutes the night before because they've forgotten about it or they've not prepped right, and then they come with something that's half baked.
Google is your friend sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Only sometimes.
Yeah.
Google's a good thing.
And Stack Overflow.
Right? Yeah.
Stack Overflow.
Agreed. That's why we talked through, when we got someone to do some automation tests, we got them to talk through why they did what they did. And obviously if they didn't match up, they couldn't explain it, we knew that they copied and pasted it. But also we knew that our application was difficult and different. So you wouldn't be able to just copy from an online example. You'd have to at least tailor it a little bit. But yeah, there is always that chance of people copying things.
I did read online that there was somewhere interviewing people, and they said like it's going to be a live test, so you actually as part of the interview. But feel free to Google, feel free to go on Stack Overflow during these things, because that is what you do in real life. And half the battle is knowing where to look, not necessarily knowing the answers, and actually knowing that your workplace and in the interview, because of course you're interviewing the employer as well, that they're actually willing to let you do those things, because that is industry norm, is quite important. Interviews are stressful enough as they are, especially when you've got 3 or 4 people just watching you with your screen share, to know that you've got the freedom to be able to do those sorts of things. But then of course you get judged on how well do you Google.
Yeah.
I think we're all right at doing that these days.
Other search engines are available.
Yeah.
Not as good, but they are available.
It's not what my phone tells me.
I think the thing about all of this is the fact that we need to know upfront what we're aiming to get out of that test. And if you don't put the right mechanisms in place, you're never going to get the right answers. So that is a major risk, is that you're asking the wrong question and you always get the wrong answer. So you need to make sure that you're giving people a right, and you're right, Chris, the people are judging you as well. So therefore, as an employer, so we need to make sure that we're asking relevant questions, so that we're not put off by a 9-hour test, and that it is a true reflection, like Russell has done. It's work that you're likely to do, so that when we do go into our work, we're not surprised by the work we're given. And I think this is also, we've touched on technical tests given beforehand, also during the interview. So we ask sort of some more programmatic questions as part of that, but we also think about sort of the tester's mentality. How can they think about the sort of process? So we have various sort of ideas as to how they think and process information that they're given and work out solutions. And again, they're open-ended, so that they don't have not a closed question. Sometimes you have curveballs where people come up with completely random thoughts that you never have thought of, but they're really good and relevant. So I think that's an important thing, is having a clear understanding of what the questions are that you're asking are relevant, and you know what you're setting yourself up for and expecting from a successful candidate.
It's a broader thing that I think is valuable in software development, which is it's setting expectations. Like, we've written a job spec that's full of these things, then they come in and the test I'm being given seems like it's not relevant to those things. Maybe telling people kind of what you're expecting from them from this thing. We're not expecting perfection. These are the sorts of things we want. That helps out throughout software development, doesn't it? Because I want this piece of work done. What does it need to look like? What is in scope? What isn't in scope? How much time is there? What sort of tools have I got to use these things from? We can all do better, I'm sure. And we've probably got nightmare scenarios. We've talked about 9-hour tech things, but have we got like any sort of good examples, things that we think are like ideal scenarios that we've done, and things that are being particularly successful beyond what we've already mentioned?
I've heard of them. I've never done this, which is giving someone a broken test that is actually one of your real tests. Again, publicly available. Use it in source control Git and ask them to debug why it doesn't work, rather than anything else. But again, that could be forever ending. But that gives, again, someone an idea of the coding, how you do things, gives them context. You could do that in an interview situation whilst you're there. Give them half an hour just to see how far they get, see what they look for. And you can kind of time box that quite easily. That'll give you quite a lot of insights, I would have thought. I think that's quite a good idea, personally. If you've got the opportunity to do that, it gives someone the true flavour of what your team have to deal with.
Well, for some of us, I know we've concentrated a lot on software, but with hardware tests, sometimes we give them a bit of equipment, and see whether they can actually interact with it in a safe way. Sometimes if people are not happy with hardware, then they can be very hands-off and not embrace it at all, which can sometimes cause problems. But but being able to wire up an oscilloscope or something like that is very telling.
The examples where I've had the most successes would be less of the upfront stuff, but more of the actually in the interview, giving them a whiteboard and saying, okay, test an ATM system. We're going to put a new ATM in and it's going to have this functionality. How would you test it? Not necessarily list the test cases out, but show us the process of how you would think about testing it, and give them a whiteboard pen and say, do what you need to help you articulate it. Yes, it might not be showing the technical skills, but it shows you the communication, it shows you the thought process. And for me, that's a huge part of what we need as testers. Obviously, if you're hiring automation testers, then you need to focus on the stuff that Russell's saying, with the debugging the tests and doing the coding tests and whatever else you need in that process. But for me, from a test perspective, I've always lent towards the talk me through how you would approach testing this live, rather than having it as an upfront pre-prepared scenario.
Yeah, I think for me, it's probably a combination of pretty much everyone's thing. Like, I can remember when I was working for the metering company, one of the things that we would do is we would drop a piece of hardware on their laps. It's not physically drop them, but we'd give them a piece of the hardware to hold. What was quite telling was how they interacted with it, because as a tester, you're probably quite inquisitive, quite curious, and so by giving them something that they could start looking around, pressing buttons, searching around, navigating and things, you get to see how they're physically approaching it with no particular agenda. But if you handed something that somebody knows they're going to be working with to them, and they look at it and go, that's nice, put it down, and then start telling them how wonderful they are, versus they've looked at it, they're going to ask questions, they start to interact with it. That's showing the characteristics of a tester that we talk about, but it's also showing us how they would actually interact with something live, and that can show off certain testing characteristics. That was very smart. That wasn't me that came up with that, because I'm not that smart. That was, I mean, and the person that would do that part of the test told me, she said, like, if the people weren't interacting with the device that they were going to be working with, that was a huge red flag for her. You know, I kind of get it. If anything, I think that's probably the best indicator that we had in that place.
I think that's a good thing with that particular meter, is that you could interact with it. And also with that particular scenario, you can see how people's thought processes are going. Are they structured? Do they go look at the outside? Do they press the buttons? Do they see a pattern in those buttons? You know, it's those sort of things that are subtle but important to look for in testers. And so as interviewers, this goes back to my point of having a purpose. Is your purpose to, with the meter, how they interact with it, and then the subtlety of how are they then testing it or seeing how it works or doing things like that. You know, you can preempt them as to asking them, how do you think it works, and so therefore see how they interact with it, but making sure that you know beforehand what you're aiming to get out of that particular scenario.
Yeah, I think showing them how you'll work, this is what you'll be working with, all those things are great indicators, and depending on what you'll be working with and what role you're trying to recruit for, will definitely inform that differently. Like, you know, if someone is expected to be doing automated testing, then absolutely they need to be doing that. If they're expected to be doing more exploratory or other things, or if they're hardware informed,
it'd be awkward, because you know me by name. But I think that's definitely the aspiration. I agree wholeheartedly on that. But you do, for example, consultancies where you may not know what the project or what technology stack is going to be. You've got to think of the people that can actually be the pragmatic ones, who will pick up and learn, who will adapt, who can show the drive to want to learn over the knowledge. Yeah,
it's a big context shift for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we've had a good long chat here. I think it's been really interesting, and quite relevant to all of us that have been having to recruit people. And so if you have had any interesting experiences in interview tests for testers, give us a shout and let us know if you've thought of anything that was a good idea, or if you've got any nightmare examples of things. It's really interesting, and I don't think anyone's doing it perfectly, and we all have different contexts, so it is a really interesting conversation, and it will continue to evolve. Thank you once again for joining us for this podcast episode. We're still really enjoying making it. We haven't got too angry with each other so far, which is really important. If you really do enjoy, please do like, share, review, tell people you're listening to it. We really love seeing your comments on social media. If you want to tag us on things, we are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, all just Testing Peers, either with a space or without, you'll find us. We're also on Patreon if you want to sort of give us some sort of financial impetus to be able to carry on. We've got a few different tiers you can explore on there to support us. We are super happy that we've got some lovely people already supporting us on there, and it's a really nice little group. Apart from that, thank you to our lovely sponsors, Saffron QA, Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.
For now, it's goodbye from the testing peers.
Goodbye.